The battlefield was breaking apart. The colonel's voice thundered, "Retreat!" But before the men could turn, one figure walked forward alone, and with a single word, the SEAL code name, everything changed. Welcome to Velvo's Stories, cinematic tales of hidden courage, untold sacrifices, and the moments that rewrite destiny. These stories are fictional, created to inspire and move you. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Your stories fuel ours. The valley reeked of smoke and fear. Explosions rolled across the ridgeline like distant thunder, scattering dust into the gray sky. Radio chatter screamed through headsets, a mess of overlapping orders and raw panic. Soldiers stumbled back through the mud, their eyes wide, rifles half raised, but their resolve breaking. Colonel Matthews stood near the forward command post, his jaw clenched, his voice booming above the chaos. "Fall back! Everyone back to the tree line! This position is lost!" The words cut like a blade. Retreat. To the men, it meant failure. To Matthews, it meant survival. But to one figure standing in the shadows of the battered command post, it meant something else entirely. Lieutenant Commander Elena Ward tightened the straps of her tactical vest, her fingers brushing against the chain hidden beneath it. She had been here before. Not this valley, not this war, but this moment. The moment when leaders gave in to fear, when men turned their backs on what could still be won. And every time she had made the same choice, step forward when others stepped back. She moved, her boots sinking into the mud. The men were already pulling away, dragging wounded comrades, eyes darting nervously between the cliffs and the collapsing lines. Colonel Matthews turned on her, fury flashing in his eyes. "Ward, you heard me. We're pulling out. That's an order." Elena's gaze was steady, her voice quiet but unshaken. "If we leave now, half of them won't make it back to the tree line. The enemy has us bracketed. The only way out is through." Matthews snarled, his face red. "Your logistics, nothing more. You don't give orders here." A ripple of laughter, thin and cruel, rose from a few nearby officers despite the chaos. A woman, dressed in gear that looked too clean for battle, daring to contradict the colonel? It was absurd, at least to them. But Elena didn't flinch. Her eyes swept the valley. She could see what Matthews didn't. The machine guns on the ridges hadn't shifted yet. The artillery was still repositioning. There was a gap, narrow and fleeting, but wide enough for soldiers who believed they could push forward. Her hand moved slowly to her vest. She pulled out the chain, the small piece of gold and silver that had lived hidden against her chest for years. The SEAL Trident glinted in the gray light, a quiet symbol that roared louder than any order. The laughter died instantly. Matthews froze, his eyes widening. "You—" Elena's voice was calm, but it tarried through the chaos like steel. "You want to retreat? Fine, but I'm not turning back. I know the code, I know the way through, and if anyone here still wants to live, they'll follow me." She stepped past him, her boots splashing in the mud, her silhouette framed by smoke and fire. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Soldiers turned, torn between the order to retreat and the sight of one figure walking forward into the storm. Then came a whisper, one soldier speaking to another, eyes wide with recognition. "That's her! That's Specter!" The code name. It rippled through the ranks like fire on dry grass. Specter, the operator whose name had lived only in rumor, whose missions had never been written down, whose existence was denied at every level. And now she was here, not a story, not a ghost, but flesh and blood, walking forward alone. One soldier followed, then another, rifles lifted, boots pounded into the mud. The retreat slowed, then faltered, then stopped altogether. Matthew shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. This is insubordination! You'll get them all killed! But no one was listening anymore, because Elena Ward, once hidden in silence, had spoken the code name that changed everything, and the battlefield had chosen her. The valley was alive with echoes of war. Mortars thumped in the distance, rounds arcing high before exploding in showers of dirt and steel. Every detonation shook the ground beneath their boots, every impact driving the retreating soldiers further into panic. But not all of them were retreating anymore. Elena Ward walked steadily forward, her posture straight despite the chaos, the sealed trident gleaming faintly against the dark of her vest. The name Specter whispered across the lines, louder than the colonel's orders, louder than the thunder of artillery. Behind her, a dozen soldiers hesitated in the mud. They exchanged glances, torn between the chain of command and the silent authority radiating from the woman in front of them. Then, as if pulled by gravity, they moved. Boots pounded through the mire, rifles raised, not towards retreat, but towards the fight. Colonel Matthews barked into his radio, his face purple with rage. "Get back here, all of you! That's an order!" But his words were empty in the smoke. His command, once iron, now felt brittle, and the men knew it. Elena crouched at the edge of a shattered trench, scanning the ridgeline. Enemy fire stitched across the valley, arcs of tracer rounds glowing red against the dusk. She studied the rhythm of it, her trained eye catching patterns the others couldn't. The enemy thought the Americans would fall back, so they were overextending, shifting men to block the retreat routes. That left their center thin, dangerously thin. She gestured to the soldiers clustered near her. "Listen carefully. They expect you to run, so we're going to do the one thing they won't expect." A private, mud streaked across his helmet, stared at her. We're going forward?" Elena's eyes never left the ridgeline. "We're going through, straight at their weak point. Hit them before their artillery resets, and we break this valley wide open." There was silence for a heartbeat. Then one of the corporals nodded sharply. "You heard her? Move!" The squad surged ahead, hugging the trench line for cover. Elena moved with them, her body low, her rifle balanced against her shoulder. Bullets hissed overhead, snapping into the dirt wall inches away, but she didn't flinch. Every step was calculated, every pause perfectly timed between bursts of enemy fire. The further they went, the more soldiers peeled from the retreating line to follow. At first a handful, then 24, then more. Men who had been running moments ago now turned, faces grim, eyes locked on the figure in the lead. Colonel Matthews saw it happening, his authority unraveling in real time. He slammed his headset onto the ground, fury radiating from him like heat. But even he knew shouting was useless now. The battlefield had shifted. The men had chosen. Elena led them to the base of a ridge scarred with shell craters and shattered rock. Enemy machine guns spat fire from bunkers cut into the slope, but their aim was erratic, their fire discipline sloppy. They weren't ready for an advance. She dropped to one knee, signaling halt. "We hit them hard, from 3 angles, suppression left and right, assault through the middle. Don't think, move, trust me." For a moment, hesitation flickered in their eyes. She wasn't their commander, wasn't even in their chain of command. But then her hand brushed the trident again, and the hesitation vanished. She rose. "Now!" Gunfire exploded as soldiers unleashed a storm of rounds against the bunkers. Smoke grenades arced overhead, hissing as white plumes rolled across the slope. Through the haze, Elena charged, her boots pounding against stone, her rifle steady. Bullets whipped past, close enough to sting her cheek, but she kept moving. She hit the first bunker like a storm, diving through the smoke. 2 enemy gunners spun toward her, too slow. 2 bursts from her rifle dropped them both, their bodies crumpling against the sandbags. Behind her, her squad poured in, grenades shattering the rest of the nest. The slope erupted into chaos. Enemy soldiers scrambled, shouting orders, firing blindly into the smoke, but they were no longer fighting men in retreat. They were fighting men who had found a leader, who had found a reason to push forward when all else seemed lost. Elena's voice cut through the din, sharp and clear. "Keep pushing. Don't stop until we break them." And they did. With every step, every shot, the retreat was replaced with momentum. The colonel's order was nothing but smoke now, carried away on the wind. From the shattered bunker, Elena looked back across the valley. Dozens of soldiers were moving forward, no longer running, no longer afraid. And in their eyes she saw it, not just belief, but something stronger. They weren't following out of desperation anymore. They were following her. The ridge shook beneath their boots as the last bunker collapsed in fire. Smoke curled upward into the bruised sky, painting the battlefield in gray and orange. For a moment, there was silence, the kind of silence that makes soldiers believe they've actually won. But Elena Ward knew better. She dropped behind the sandbags, scanning the horizon through the haze. Her pulse was steady, not calm but trained, the same rhythm that had carried her through countless fights she was never supposed to admit existed. And then she saw it. Movement in the distance, shadows spilling across the ridgeline like ink, reinforcements, enemy forces rushing into position with terrifying speed, dragging mortars, setting up heavy machine guns, their voices echoing as they barked orders in a language half the men didn't understand, but every soldier knew the tone. It was the sound of a counterstrike. Elena's jaw tightened. They're regrouping. We've got 2 minutes, maybe less, before they hammer this ridge flat. The men around her stiffened. They had clawed their way uphill, beaten back bunkers they weren't supposed to touch, and now the weight of a full enemy company was bearing down on them. Colonel Matthews' voice blared over the radio, raw with fury. "I told you to retreat. Now you've trapped them on that ridge. Do you realize what you've done?" Elena keyed her mic without hesitation. "What I've done is keep them alive. We hold this ridge, we break their line. If we fall back now, they'll crush us in the open." "Ward," she cut him off. "You want to talk about orders? Fine. But while you're shouting, I'll be fighting." She ripped the headset off and tossed it aside, her eyes sweeping the soldiers who were staring at her with a mix of fear and something else, something sharper. "Listen up," her voice rang out over the ridge. "They're coming with everything they've got. If we break, if we run, they'll roll over us like a wave. But if we stand here, if we hold this ridge, we turn their strength into weakness. This is where we stop them." For a moment, silence. The men shifted, exchanging glances, doubt fighting with determination. And then one sergeant raised his rifle high. "With her!" The cry tore through the smoke. Boots stamped into the ground. Dozens of rifles snapped into position, all facing the oncoming storm. Elena crouched behind the sandbags, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she reloaded, chambered around, and adjusted her sights. Her heart pounded, but not with fear. It was the pulse of purpose, the rhythm of someone who had been born for moments like this. The counterstrike hit like a hammer. Mortars whistled down from the sky, explosions tearing into the ridge, flinging dirt and steel into the air. Men ducked, covering their heads as the earth shook. Enemy rifles barked, tracer fire carving red lines through the smoke. Elena rose into it. She squeezed the trigger, each shot a razor, cutting down shapes in the haze. Her voice carried through the chaos. "Target the gunners first! Take out their heavy fire!" Her soldiers obeyed. Well-placed bursts tore through enemy crews, silencing machine guns before they could lock the ridge in a wall of bullets. Grenades arced down the slope, detonating with thunder that rattled teeth. The enemy pressed harder, bodies spilling forward like a tide, and still the ridge held. Elena moved along the line, her presence like a steady flame in the storm. She knelt beside a young private, his hands shaking too hard to reload. Calmly, she guided his fingers, snapped the magazine into place, and met his eyes. Breathe. You're not alone. Now, fight. The boy nodded, his fear replaced by something steadier. As the battle raged, whispers rippled, even here, even now. Specter. Soldiers said it under their breath, not as rumor anymore, but as rallying cry. Minutes dragged into eternity. Smoke choked the air, bullets screamed overhead, and bodies fell. But still, the ridge held. Then, through the haze, Elena spotted the danger that could undo it all. A mortar team was setting up on the far slope, their tube angled straight at the center of the American position. If they fired, the ridge would become a slaughterhouse. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask for volunteers. She just moved. Breaking cover, she sprinted across open ground, bullets snapping at her heels, mud spraying beneath her boots. Shouts rose from both sides, enemy gunners swinging toward her, her own soldiers yelling after her in disbelief. She dove into a crater, rolled, and came up firing. 3 bursts, 3 men down. The 4th turned the mortar toward her, panic flashing in his eyes. Too late. Elena's rifle cracked, dropping him before he could touch the trigger. The ridge erupted in cheers as the enemy's last heavy weapon fell silent. But Elena didn't smile. She knew what it meant. The battle wasn't won, only shifted. The enemy would keep coming, throwing bodies and fire until someone broke. And she knew one thing with absolute certainty. It wasn't going to be her. The ridge was a graveyard of smoke and shattered stone. Rifles cracked in steady rhythm, punctuated by the thump of grenades and the thunder of mortars. Every breath burned with dust and cordite. Yet somehow, the line still held. Elena Ward crouched behind a blasted rock, eyes scanning the field through the haze. The enemy had not broken. If anything, their numbers seemed to grow with every passing minute. Fresh squads poured in from the far tree line, their silhouettes dark against the firelit horizon. They were regrouping faster than her men could reload, and now the tide was swelling into something more dangerous. Beside her, Sergeant Kane ducked as tracer rounds hissed overhead. His face was streaked with grime, his helmet dented from near misses. "Ma'am, they're not stopping. We're running low on ammo, and if they hit us with one more push—" She cut him off, her tone sharp but steady. "Then we make sure it's their last push, not ours." She rose just enough to fire 3 quick shots, dropping shapes moving along the ridge below. When she ducked back down, her voice carried not just to Kane, but to the cluster of soldiers pressed along the sandbags. "Listen up. They think we're broken. They think this ridge is just one more piece of dirt they can bury. They're wrong. We are the wall. This is where they break." The words carried like fire, igniting sparks in tired eyes. Men who had been slumping now lifted their rifles higher, their jaws clenched with renewed resolve. But deep inside, Elena knew resolve wasn't enough. Numbers could drown courage, and the enemy had plenty of numbers left. She pressed her radio to her ear, listening through the static. Colonel Matthews' voice barked from the other end, desperate and enraged. "Ward, do you hear me? Pull them back. That's an order. If you don't retreat now, you're going to get them all killed." Elena stared down at the seal trident against her vest, the gold catching faint flickers of firelight. She remembered the day she earned it, the endless trials, the silence of instructors who never believed she'd finish. The moment the pin was pressed into her palm, with no ceremony, no applause, just a nod that said, "You survived what others couldn't." That was the weight she carried now, not for herself, but for the men who had chosen to follow her instead of turning their backs. She keyed the mic, her voice cold as steel. "With respect, Colonel, your order means nothing out here. Out here, survival speaks louder. Out here, the only name that matters is Specter." She let go of the mic and stood, fully visible, defying the storm of fire. For a heartbeat, she was a silhouette carved against flame and smoke. And then she spoke, not just to her men, but to the enemy who could hear her voice carrying across the valley. "You wanted a ghost? You've got one. Specter is here." Her words cut through the roar like a blade, and for reasons no one could explain, the battlefield paused. Soldiers on both sides froze, their eyes drawn to the figure who stood alone on the ridge, daring the storm to strike her down. It was only a moment, but in war, moments are everything. The enemy broke the silence first. A new wave surged forward, hundreds strong, bayonets glinting, voices raised in a desperate charge meant to drown the defiance of one woman. Elena turned back to her men, her eyes fierce. "Stand your ground. They think we'll break. Prove them wrong." The ridge erupted in fire. Rifles rattled. Machine guns spat fury. Grenades exploded with bone-shaking thunder. The enemy wave crashed into the slope, bodies colliding in brutal combat. Mud turned slick with blood. Steel clashed against steel as bayonets met rifles swung like clubs. Elena was everywhere at once, firing, reloading, dragging a wounded soldier behind cover, barking orders that cut through the chaos. Her presence was like gravity. Every man anchored himself to her resolve. Sergeant Kane, firing until his rifle smoked, shouted over the din, "Ma'am, we can't hold like this forever." Elena's reply was a growl, fierce and alive. "We don't need forever. We just need enough. Enough to turn belief into momentum. Enough to carve survival out of certain death. Enough to prove that Specter wasn't just a rumor, but a reckoning." As the enemy pressed harder, Elena felt something shift, not in the ridge, not in the mud, but in the men themselves. Fear was gone. In its place burned something the enemy could never match, the certainty that they were fighting with a leader who would never bend, never yield, never retreat. The charge faltered, the wave broke, and for the first time the enemy began to fall back. The ridge still stood, and so did Elena. The night sky pulsed with fire. Flares arced overhead, casting the battlefield in ghastly white light before fading into darkness again. The ridge smoldered, a jagged scar across the valley floor. Dozens of bodies lay scattered on both sides, silent witnesses to the brutal exchange. But the enemy wasn't finished. From the tree line below, horns and shouts echoed. More shadows surged forward, not disorganized squads this time, but a full coordinated assault. Lines of enemy soldiers moved with grim precision, machine guns set up behind them, mortars already thumping. It was the last push. Elena Ward knelt behind the sandbags, running her hand along the worn edges of her rifle. Her body ached, her uniform torn and smeared with dirt and blood. Yet her eyes were steady, her breath even. Around her, The men looked at her the way drowning sailors look at the last solid ground in a storm.
Sergeant Kane slid into the trench beside her, face paled but voice firm. "We can't repel this, ma'am. We're down to half ammo, less than that in grenades. They'll bury us." Elena looked past him at the soldiers who were listening, fear gnawing at them, even as they gripped their rifles tighter. She could hear the colonel again through the abandoned radio, his voice ragged with desperation. "Ward, for God's sakes, pull them back! That's an order! You can't win this!" Elena didn't touch the radio. Instead, she rose high enough that the men could see her clearly, the sealed Trident catching the last light of a dying flare. Her voice carried strong, cutting through the chaos. "They think this is where we die. They think this ridge will swallow us. But hear me now. This is where we make history. You don't retreat from history. You carve your names into it." The words struck like thunder. Soldiers straightened, faces hardened, fear turned into grim resolve. Elena crouched again, her eyes sharp. "We don't meet them head on. We bleed them from the sides." Kane split the squad, suppression from the ridge, 2 fire teams flanking through the smoke. Hit them where they don't expect. Kane hesitated only a second before nodding. Orders rippled through the line. Men shifted, moved, found positions. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A plan in the face of chaos, a leader where once there had been none. The enemy wave crashed into the slope. Bullets screamed, tearing into sandbags and stone. Men ducked, fired, reloaded with shaking hands. Grenades thundered, earth raining down in heavy clumps. The ridge shook, but it didn't fall. Elena Ward led the left flank herself. Crawling through smoke, she slipped along the ridge's edge until she could see the advancing columns below. Their formation was tight, their commander shouting, their attention fixed on the center. Perfect. She signaled, and her team unleashed a torrent of fire into their exposed side. The enemy line buckled, confusion exploding as men spun to face the sudden threat. At the same time, Kane's squad erupted from the right, pouring fire from another angle. Caught in a vice, the enemy's charge faltered. Their shouts turned from battle cries to orders of desperation. Their mortars fell silent as crews scrambled to cover themselves. Elena rose higher, firing until her rifle clicked dry. She dropped the empty mag, slammed in another, and shouted so every soldier could hear, "Push them! Drive them back!" The Americans surged, fury ignited. Men who had been ready to retreat hours ago now charged downhill, rifles blazing, bayonets fixed. The enemy broke, their formation unraveling into chaos. Some fought, some fled, some dropped their weapons entirely. And in the center of it all was Elena Ward, the trident glinting on her chest as she moved like a force of nature, cutting through smoke and fire. From the command post far behind, Colonel Matthews watched in disbelief. His retreat order had been ignored, his authority shattered, but his soldiers had not died. Against every expectation, they were winning. He slumped into a chair, his face pale. The name whispered across the valley reached even him. Specter. On the ridge, the last echoes of gunfire faded. The enemy's final push had crumbled. The battlefield was silent again, broken only by the ragged breaths of exhausted men who could barely comprehend what they had just survived. Sergeant Kane dropped beside Elena, sweat streaking his face. We did it!" Elena's eyes swept the valley, the fires burning low. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. Her voice was quiet, firm. No, they did it. They chose to stand when everyone told them to run. She touched the trident lightly and then let her hand fall. The name Specter would linger here long after the smoke cleared, not as a rumor, not as a ghost, but as the truth that had saved them all. Dawn crept slowly across the valley, bleeding pale gold into the smoke-stained sky.
The ridge was quiet now, the thunder of war reduced to the soft crackle of distant fires and the groans of the wounded. Soldiers slumped against sandbags and shattered stone, their bodies broken, their eyes hollow, but alive. They had held. Elena Ward stood at the highest point of the ridge, her boots planted in mud still black with soot. Her rifle hung loosely at her side, her chest rising and falling with steady, measured breaths. Exhaustion gnawed at every muscle, but her posture remained unbroken. Around her, men moved with reverence, not just toward a superior, but to the one who had carried them through fire when no one else would. "Specter," one private whispered as he passed, a word no longer forbidden, but sacred. The name carried across the line, spoken not as a rumor, but as fact. From the valley floor, the remnants of the enemy dragged themselves back into the trees, beaten, shattered, and unwilling to test the ridge again. Against all odds, the Americans had not only survived, they had held the ground their colonel had deemed lost. The crunch of boots pulled Elena's gaze to the rear. Colonel Matthews approached, his face pale beneath his cap, his uniform smeared with dirt, but his eyes burning with anger. He strode toward her, jaw set, fists clenched, as if sheer authority could erase what had happened. "Ward," he spat, his voice carrying enough venom for the men nearby to stiffen. "You disobeyed a direct order. You endangered every man on this ridge. You undermined command. Do you have any idea what that means?" Elena didn't move. Her eyes held his, calm and steady, as if his rage were nothing more than wind against stone. Then, slowly, she lifted the chain around her neck and drew it out from beneath her vest. The sealed trident gleamed in the morning light, brighter now than it ever had in the haze of battle. The murmurs rippled instantly. Men turned, eyes widening, whispers spreading through the ranks like a current. "Specter. She really is Specter." Matthews froze mid-step. For the first time since she'd known him, he faltered. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Elena's voice was quiet, but it carried like a blade. "I know exactly what it means. It means that while you were calling for retreat, these men chose to fight. It means that when you abandoned them to fear, they found something else to believe in. And it means that the only reason you can stand here and accuse me is because they followed me instead of you." Matthew's face flushed crimson. "You think that trinket excuses insubordination? That name, Specter, is nothing but shadows and myths. I command here, not you." Elena stepped closer, the trident catching the rising sun between them. "You're right about one thing. Specter was a shadow, a name whispered in places men weren't meant to survive. But today, it's no myth. It's standing in front of you. And it's the reason every man here is alive." Silence hung heavy. The colonel's chest heaved, but his eyes flicked nervously to the soldiers gathered around them. Not one of them looked at him. Every eye was fixed on Elena. One by one, the men straightened. Some lifted their rifles in salute. Others simply stood taller. And then Sergeant Kane, grime-streaked and exhausted, snapped to attention and raised his hand in a crisp salute to Elena. It was the spark. Dozens followed, the line of soldiers saluting not the colonel, not the chain of command, but the woman who had carried them through the storm. Matthew's face twisted, but he said nothing. Whatever power he thought he held had already bled out into the dirt. Elena didn't ask in it. She didn't smile, didn't revel in the victory. She let the trident fall back against her chest, the weight of it pressing into her skin like a reminder. Specter was no longer a secret, no longer a shadow. And on this ridge, carved in blood and fire, the name had become something unshakable. Not rumor, not myth, legacy.